case we have never met, I'm Michael Price, and I want to help you succeed in growing your business.
Welcome. I'm Nancy, your co-host.
And I'm Michael Price, your host.
Last month, people visited federal websites 2.116 billion times.
That is a staggering number.
Right. I mean, we are talking about veterans trying to access health benefits, citizens filing taxes, small business owners applying for federal loans.
Yeah, these are essential services.
Exactly. But if you are one of the 70 million adults in the U.S. who report having a disability, you actually have a 63% chance of hitting a digital brick wall on the government's most critical public-facing sites.
Which is just wild when you consider that accessing those sites isn't optional. Like, this is essential civic infrastructure.
Sure.
If a blind user's screen reading software cannot parse the code on, say, a disaster relief application, they just don't get relief.
Wow. Yeah, that puts it in perspective. Today, we are looking at how the government is finally attempting to fix this, but they aren't doing it with, sweeping new legislation or loud protests.
No, they're doing it by weaponizing their purchase orders.
Exactly. Welcome to a brand new deep dive. We are looking at a quiet revolution hidden in the paperwork, and we have a fascinating stack of sources to guide us today.
We do. We're analyzing a batch of internal government memos dated March 17, 2026, alongside a really deeply reported article from the Federal News Network by Justin Doubleday.
The mission of our deep dive today is to really unpack this massive behind-the-scenes shift. The federal government is basically turning the mundane act of procurement, literally just how they buy laptops and software, into the primary lever for changing the entire tech industry.
Yeah, looking at these documents side by side reveals something much larger than just a tech update. It's really a masterclass in behavioral economics.
Oh, for sure.
We are looking at how a massive bureaucracy is finally learning to use the sheer gravity of federal spending to manipulate the commercial tech market.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to understand the cure, we really first have to understand the specific disease, like what Section 5008 actually is and why the government is currently failing its own test.
Right, so Section 508, it refers to a specific amendment to the Rehabilitation Act of 1973.
Okay.
It legally requires federal agencies to make their electronic and information technology accessible to people with disabilities, but the data from the General Services Administration, the GSA, shows this massive disconnect between the law and reality.
Yeah, I saw that. According to their new data-driven assessment across 212 agencies, fewer than half of the government's public-facing information and communication technologies actually comply with those standards.
And they abbreviate that as ICT, Information and Communication Technologies.
Right, so we are talking about everything from the homepage of the IRS to the internal HR software used by federal employees, down to the actual physical hardware.
Exactly, and the blind spot here is just massive.
Oh, totally. The memos show that agencies have been focusing almost all of their testing on websites, but they are just completely neglecting the hardware and software, which leaves federal employees with disabilities in an impossible position. I mean, think about it. If the public-facing website works, but the internal database an employee needs to process those web requests is completely inaccessible,
then the whole system is still broken.
Right, and the sources point to a few systemic root causes for this. Limited funding, severe staffing shortages, and really high workforce turnover.
Which makes sense. When a 30-year accessibility expert retires from an agency, all of their institutional knowledge about which systems work and which vendors cut corners usually walks right out the door with them.
Yeah, they lose all that memory. But there is one specific finding in this GSA report that really highlights the dysfunction.
The follow-through gap.
Exactly. The memos call it the gap between requirement setting and follow-through. Agencies are actually putting the Section 508 accessibility requirements into their vendor contracts.
So the lawyers are doing their jobs, right? They are writing the rules down.
Yeah.
But once the vendor delivers the $1 million software package, the agency never actually verifies if it works for people with disabilities. They just accept the delivery.
I mean, it's like paying for a really rigorous, expensive home inspection. You hire an expert. They hand you a 100-page binder detailing, a cracked foundation, black mold, a leaky roof. And then you just toss the binder in the trash, refuse to read it, and buy the house anyway. The inspection happened, but it didn't change your behavior at all.
What's fascinating here is the psychology behind that bureaucratic behavior.
Huh.
Procurement officers operate in a world of checklists.
Okay.
They feel they've done their job because they checked the box. They included the legal boilerplate in the initial request for proposal. but they are confusing the presence of a rule with the actual enforcement of a standard,
And vendors learn very quickly that they won't be penalized for handing over a house with a leaky roof.
which perfectly explains why simply writing stricter rules has worked for the last 3 decades. The vendors know the government won't check the roof.
Right, so since writing rules into contracts and hoping for the best is a proven failure, the GSA is orchestrating this massive pivot in strategy. They are changing what they buy and how they buy it.
And the sources call this the buy over build strategy.
Right. To execute this, they moved to centralized acquisition directly at the GSA.
Yeah, Mike Gifford, he's a senior strategist at Civic Actions who's quoted in the Federal News Network article. He points out that this centralization is really the linchpin.
How so?
It takes procurement power away from hundreds of fractured, isolated agency offices and gives the GSA the leverage to monitor implementation across the entire government.
Oh, that makes sense.
And Gifford provides some crucial historical context here, too. Using procurement as a driver for accessibility was actually one of the original foundational goals when the Section 508 law was updated back in 1998.
Wait, really?
Yeah, the vision was always there: force the market to adapt by making the federal government the most demanding, lucrative customer in the room. It just took 33 years for the bureaucracy to figure out how to operationalize that vision.
Wow. So under the centralized power, they are pushing the buy over build framework. Instead of a federal agency hiring a developer to build a custom in-house software system from scratch just for them, the GSA wants agencies to prioritize existing commercial off-the-shelf products.
Exactly, buy it off the shelf.
But I am genuinely struggling with this logic. Wait, doesn't building a custom in-house solution give the government more control over making sure it's 100% accessible? Why rely on commercial vendors who have already been failing?
Well, on a micro level, your logic holds up perfectly. A custom build does give you total control over that one specific tool.
Right. I can say, build me exactly this.
But building custom tech is inherently isolated. It only helps the people using that one specific bespoke government program. The GSA is looking at the macro level here.
Okay.
The buy over build strategy turns the government from a custom boutique shopper into a wholesale buyer with the leverage of a massive retailer.
Oh, I see. When you buy in that kind of bulk, you don't just take what is on the shelf. You dictate to the factory exactly how the product is manufactured.
Exactly, and the factory doesn't run 2 separate assembly lines if they can avoid it. If the U.S. government says to a massive commercial vendor like a company that makes widespread HR software or video conferencing tools that they must overhaul their accessibility to win a $5 billion federal contract, the vendor doesn't just make a special government version.
They just update their core product.
They update everything.
Let's pause on that for a second, because the implications there are huge. So the reason a platform like Zoom or Microsoft Teams might suddenly get incredibly robust screen reader support for my small private business is actually because the GSA held a massive federal contract hostage.
That is the exact mechanism of change. Forcing commercial vendors to adapt in order to win federal dollars changes the entire tech ecosystem.
That's brilliant.
The government is essentially weaponizing its budget to subsidize and improve the accessible commercial tech market for everyone everywhere.
Okay, the strategy is brilliant in theory, but implementing it requires solving the very problem we started with.
The follow-through gap.
Right. If the entire strategy relies on buying commercial tech, how does the government actually verify that these commercial products are accessible before they sign the check? We are back to the home inspection. How do they force the procurement officers to actually read the report?
This requires diving into the mechanics of the paperwork, specifically a document called an Accessibility Conformance Report, or an ACR.
Right, the ACRs. If you're listening to this and your eyes are glazing over at the phrase Accessibility Conformance Report, think of it as a nutritional label for software.
That's a great way to put it.
Just like a label tells you if there are peanuts or trans fats in your food, an ACR is supposed to tell a procurement officer exactly what accessibility barriers are baked into the software's code.
The problem is that historically those nutritional labels have been completely unreadable.
Oh yeah.
An agency would ask a vendor for an ACR, and the vendor would hand over this dense 50-page PDF filled with jargon, caveats, and legal loopholes.
Basically designed to confuse people.
Exactly. It was impossible for a normal procurement officer to parse, let alone compare against a competitor's product.
So to fix this, the memos say the GSA has developed a new beta version of a centralized ACR repository, and it's built around something called the OpenACR format.
Yeah, OpenACR standardizes the data. It forces vendors to submit these procurement reports in a machine-readable, uniform way,
So no more messy PDFs.
right? Every vendor has to answer the same questions in the same format, using the exact same metrics.
And putting them all in a centralized repository means the entire federal government is suddenly looking at the same filing cabinet.
Yes,
The services highlight how this eliminates duplicative testing. Like if a vendor's software gets a validated, tested ACR in the system for a contract with the Department of Energy, the Department of Agriculture can just look at that same validated report instead of starting from scratch.
and that single centralized reference point solved the retirement problem we discussed earlier.
Oh, right, when the 30-year veteran leaves.
Exactly. When that procurement veteran retires today, the agency doesn't lose all knowledge of which vendors cut corners. The institutional memory lives in the repository. It's accessible to every new hire on their very first day.
But I still see a massive loophole here. These ACRs are generated by the vendors themselves. They are self-reporting their own accessibility.
True.
If vendors are the ones generating these ACRs to self-report their accessibility, aren't we just trusting the fox in the henhouse? How does the repository fix lying?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the answer is cross-referencing.
Okay, how so?
When a vendor submitted an isolated, messy PDF to one specific agency, there was zero transparency. The Navy didn't know what the vendor told the EPA,
Right.
but by putting all of these standardized reports into a single government-wide repository, that data becomes highly visible to every procurement officer in the country simultaneously.
Oh, wow. So a vendor can no longer give one highly optimistic story to one agency and a completely different, heavily caveated story to another?
No, they can't. They are on the record permanently in front of the entire federal buying apparatus.
That is a huge shift.
It is. The transparency of the centralized system creates a really hostile environment for false claims. If a vendor lies on an open ACR and one agency discovers the software is inaccessible, that failure is immediately visible to every other agency considering that vendor.
So the reputational risk across the entire federal landscape becomes like mathematically disastrous for the vendor.
Exactly.
Okay, so the repository makes the data visible and it makes lying incredibly risky. But visibility doesn't automatically equal compliance. If I am a procurement officer and I can see a vendor's reports, what actual power do I have to enforce the rules before the contract is signed? And how do I guarantee the vendor actually delivers what they promised?
This is where the GSA is bringing in some serious modern tools to audit their own people. We're looking at the solicitation review tool, commonly referred to as the SRT.
Yeah, the SRT. The GSA has updated it with artificial intelligence capabilities, deeply integrating it with their accessibility requirements tool.
And it is vital to understand the exact mechanism of this AI because it is not doing what most people might assume when they hear AI and software testing in the same sentence.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The AI is not there to test the vendor's software.
No.
The AI isn't booting up a program and checking if a screen reader works. The AI is there to audit the government's own contracts.
Think of it as an algorithmic proofreader. It ingests massive 500-page requests for proposals before they ever go public.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it scans the document, flags missing legal requirements, and alerts the procurement officers.
So it automates the review of the federal solicitations themselves?
Yes, it ensures that the correct Section 508 clauses are consistently and accurately incorporated from day one.
It acts as an absolute safeguard against human error in the procurement office, ensuring the government is demanding the right standards before a single bid is even accepted.
But an ironclad contract still needs enforcement at the end of the line. The AI can't stop a vendor from delivering a broken product.
Right. The AI just polices the paperwork.
Exactly. The real teeth of this entire strategy and the mechanism that will actually force a vendor to change their behavior is much older and much more traditional than AI.
They are hitting the vendors in the wallet.
Yes, they are. The GSA's new guidance officially mandates tying accessibility performance directly to a vendor's past performance evaluations.
And in the world of government contracting, your past performance evaluation is basically your credit score.
It is your lifeline. It dictates contract renewals, bonus structures, and future award considerations.
Right. So if a vendor promises an accessible product in their open ACR, wins the bid, but delivers something that fails Section 508 testing and leaves disabled users locked out,
that failure now goes permanently on their federal credit score.
Man, that is brutal.
A negative rating on accessibility decreases their chances of ever winning another government contract across any agency.
Furthermore, the memos point out that agencies are now explicitly instructed to actively track and document all exceptions to the standards.
Yes, if an agency is forced to grant a legal exception because a vendor's critical product is broken, that data is tracked.
It creates a paper trail of failure.
Exactly.
The entire system, from the open ACR repository to the AI contract audits to the past performance evaluations, is designed to slowly, methodically choke off the revenue streams of companies that refuse to build accessible technology.
However, the sources make it explicitly clear that all of this technological and bureaucratic infrastructure will fail without a highly trained human element.
Oh, definitely.
Mike Gifford emphasized that procurement officers need rigorous training on how to actively pull this information from vendors.
Because a tool is only as good as the person wielding it. The centralized database is incredibly powerful, but you still need a human being in the acquisition office who knows how to look a massive tech vendor in the eye and say, "Prove it. Prove that your product actually functions for the 70 million adults in the U.S. with a disability."
They have to be willing to hold the line and reject the delivery. The follow-through gap we discussed at the beginning can only be closed by a human making a definitive decision to enforce the standards.
So what does this all mean for you, the person listening right now? Why should you care about the minutia of the GSA's solicitation review tool, or how a federal procurement officer evaluates an open ACR?
That's a great question.
Because as we discussed with the wholesale buyer analogy, this quiet bureaucratic machinery directly impacts the technology you interact with every single day.
The federal government is leveraging a multi-billion-dollar budget to force a market correction.
Yeah.
If the company that makes the payroll system your private business uses, or the chat application you use to talk to your coworkers, is forced to make their platform deeply accessible to secure a federal contract.
Yeah.
Now, they will do it.
And you reap the benefits. The exact same newly accessible software is what you will end up using at your job. The government's procurement lever improves the commercial market for absolutely everyone without passing a single new sweeping law.
This raises an important question, though, a question that goes far beyond just digital accessibility.
Oh.
If the federal government successfully uses its sheer buying power to force the entire tech industry to adopt strict accessibility standards, what else could they do?
Oh, wow.
Right? What other social, ethical, or environmental standards could the government realistically enforce overnight simply by changing their procurement rules?
That is wild to think about.
The power of the post is vast, and this accessibility push is proving just how quickly a market will pivot when federal dollars are on the line.
It is a profound realization to end on. We started today talking about how massive change doesn't always look like a protest or a disruptive tech launch.
Sometimes the most tectonic shifts look like a standardized machine-readable PDF and a revised vendor evaluation form.
Yeah, the quiet machinery of bureaucracy moving billions of dollars turns out to be one of the loudest forces for change we have. We hope this deep dive gave you a new lens on how power actually operates behind the scenes and how those purchase orders eventually shape the world you live in. Thank you so much for joining us as we unpack these sources. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we will see you next time.
A special thank you to MarketUS.com for furnishing us this information. You can reach them at MarketUS.com or call them at 954-636-3232. Before we go, this deep dive was created by the MarketUS.com team. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. It's right below the subscribe link.